Good morning. I'm Sue McLaren. I'm a collection manager in the section of mammals at Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and today I'm going to talk to you about some bat specimens in our collection, and particularly bats from Pennsylvania. In this drawer right here, I've made a selection of an example of every species that's been found in Pennsylvania, and you might think that's kind of surprising because a lot of people think a bat is a bat, and they don't know that there's more than one bat. So I want to tell you just a little bit about them. This is the largest bat. It's called the hoary bat, and with this bat, it has hair on its tail. Most of the other bats don't, and it's a bat that usually doesn't start flying until after dark, so people don't even see how pretty it is with the frosted tips on its fur and so forth because it's out in complete darkness. This bat here is the next largest one. It's called the big brown bat, and it's a really common bat in Pennsylvania, and it may be the most familiar bat to a lot of people because it is the one that's most comfortable living around people. So it would be one that would be, you know, maybe in attics or barns or church steeples and those kinds of things. I've had a few that I've discovered living behind the shutters at my house, and I even had one get in the house. So that's a very common bat. The other most common bat is called the little brown bat, and it has a number of close relatives, and they're a lot less common. This bat here is the only federally endangered species, and it's been endangered for a long time, back to probably the inception of the Endangered Species Act. But otherwise, these are bats that would be typically found but not easily identified, especially if you just saw them flying around. You have to observe certain characteristics to separate them. These three bats, well, they are definitely tree dwellers, and they also fly south in the winter. One thing I should mention is all of our bats are insectivorous, and most of them catch all their insects as flying insects, and so if the bats can't fly, they can't eat. So flight is very important to them, and they have two strategies for dealing with the fact that insects will go away when it starts getting cold. Some fly south, and some hibernate. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. This bat here is called the silver-haired bat, and it's kind of one of my favorite. I don't know if you can see it at a distance, but it's got dark fur with little white tips on them, so it's kind of a pretty bat. And these two bats are actually the same species. This is the northern red bat, and the male is a little more showy, a little darker red than the female, and this is the female. And they are like the hoary bat. They have hairy, their membrane between their tail and their legs is hairy instead of plain like the other bats that you see here. The last three bats are the least common bats in Pennsylvania. In fact, they may just kind of stray into Pennsylvania at various times. This bat here is called the Seminole bat. It's actually native to Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas, and most of the very few examples that we have in Pennsylvania seem to have come here after a hurricane. And that may be just coincidental because, as museum records go, but they've been found in scattered areas, and it's usually after a storm, so they may have just been blown off course, and just like birds sometimes turn up in strange places, and there's an exciting, announcement among the bird people that there is a unique species that's somewhere and people try to go see it. Similar things can happen to other, to flying mammals. The last specimen here is called the Virginia big-eared bat. It's actually common to Virginia and West Virginia, but there's only ever been one specimen in Pennsylvania. And it was, so I'm actually showing you a West Virginia specimen. We don't have the one from Pennsylvania, but it was found in Barton Cave in Fayette County. So it's kind of one of my favorite North American bats just because of those interesting and showy ears. Couldn't fail to show that to you, even though there's only one known from Pennsylvania. It's probably also one that flew off course and arrived here. I should also explain that what I'm showing you here are called study skins. They are prepared by skinning the animal and then stuffing it with cotton and using wire for the tail and the hind legs, so that they're presented in such a way that's useful for research. And occasionally, or sort of the more old-fashioned way of preparing a bat specimen would have been to spread the wings. In this case, one is sort of not spread very much and the other is more widely spread. And in that case, what tends to happen is they are more easily damaged because the wings, even though they're very elastic when the animal's alive, when they dry out, they become a little bit brittle and kind of vulnerable to tears. The other thing is, if we spread the wings of all the bats in this drawer, for example, they might not all fit in the drawer. We'd have to rearrange them to make them fit. And since we have a large collection and a lot of people, a lot of other museums have the same situation, the solution was to prepare them the way most of the bats you're seeing here are prepared. So as I mentioned, most of the bats, oh, and by the way, this specimen right here is a little brown bat, just like this one. So you can see how much enlarged it would be if the wings were spread. As I mentioned, all of our bats are insectivorous. Most of them catch their food by flying, and they send out ultrasonic sounds, sort of pulses, that detect either obstacles or maybe food items in their environment. And they don't really detect them till they're relatively close, and it's only maybe a few feet away. And so sometimes their flight seems kind of erratic because all of a sudden they're chasing a moth or a fly or something. One thing that hadn't been very much thought of for years, we sort of took bats for granted, but they actually do a tremendous amount of, they're economically beneficial. In North America, where most of our bats are insectivorous, that beneficial aspect is because they eat a lot of pest insects. And so it reduces the amount of pesticide that's required by farmers because they're out there eating, many of them eating their weight in bugs every night. And it can be moths, flies, beetles, all kinds of different things. And also, a lot of these bats live in the woods in the summertime, and sometimes they'll just pick insects off the leaves when they're roosting. So there are different ways that they do forage, but most of it is during flight. I think if I were talking to you about 20 years ago, I wouldn't have much to say that's different than what I would have said 100 years ago. But in the last 20 years, some kind of negative things have been happening to bats. First of all, more and more forests are being cut down, and so the key places that they live and also forage in the summertime are becoming fewer and far between. Also, there is a significant problem with their getting killed at wind farms. And that's a whole long subject in and of itself. I'm not going to get into that too much, but I did want to talk a little bit about the other thing that's having a significant effect on their population, and that's something called Whitenose syndrome. Back in 2005, Whitenose was first discovered in a cave in New York, and it quickly spread to other caves and mines, because bats also live in abandoned mines. And what happened, they first called it Whitenose syndrome because all they could see was that there were dead bats out in front of a cave in the middle of the winter. So oddly enough, they were trying to fly in the middle of the winter and didn't survive. But also they had this sort of whitish area around their nose and mouth. And so it was dubbed Whitenose syndrome because it was sort of an unknown, what was causing this. Well, it turns out that there is a fungus that grows in the caves. It's somewhat likely that it's been transferred here from Europe because bats have lived successfully with this same kind of fungus in caves in Europe for a long time, but our bats had never been exposed to it. So unfortunately, the fungus likes the conditions that are in a cave, just like the bats do. So the temperature is just right for them. It's very different, and also for the, for both the fungus and the bats. And so it's kind of a difficult thing to overcome. The fungus affects their wings, and even though it's mostly found on the face, it causes dehydration, especially when the wings are affected and blood flow to the wings, and therefore, it's a devastating illness, I guess you could call it, that they're confronting. And in fact, throughout the United States, millions of bats have died, and just in Pennsylvania, probably hundreds of thousands have already died. And so places like the church at Canoe Creek State Park that used to have 20,000 bats or more, that people came from miles around to watch emerge at night, their numbers have dropped to much fewer than 100. So just from that example alone, you can see that it's a significant peril for the population. So it's been nice talking to you about our bats, and I'm looking forward to some questions. Okay, my first question is, how long do bats live? Well, generally speaking, they can live between 10 and 20 years. And that's kind of an odd thing if you're thinking, well, bats are about the same size as mice, because mice are only around for maybe 2 or 3 years at the most. But bats are relatively long-lived, and as a matter of fact, this bat, the little brown bat, the longest known life of a bat is 32 years. So there are a number of them that live much longer, and but also conversely, they produce only one, usually only one young per year. And so if there is a way to save our bats from Whitenose syndrome, it's going to take a long time for them to come back, because unlike mice that have multiple litters and multiple individuals per litter, our bats really, reproduce slowly, so that's going to be kind of a tough comeback for them. My next question is, what is the smallest bat? Well, it's probably Levi's bat. It's the smallest bat. I know it only weighs maybe 2 or 3 grams, and I wish I could give you an example of what that might be in ounces. But it is the tiniest bat, and sometimes you can't always tell when you look at the study skins which would be the smallest, because sometimes people prepare them in such a way that they look a little bigger or smaller than they are in life. Oh, what are the natural enemies of bats? That's a really good question. Well, they don't have too many natural enemies, but depending on where they're roosting, they can be confronted by snakes. And I guess many years ago now, I was a little bit surprised at how good snakes are at climbing trees. So even in whether it's in a cave or mouth of a cave or in trees, they can get picked off by a snake occasionally. Also, owls will sometimes go after bats, and there are examples of owls that are waiting at the mouths of caves to pick off a bat or two as they're emerging for their nighttime flight for foraging on bugs. And let's see, what else? Well, some of the things humans do aren't so good for them either. Oh, are there vampire bats in Pennsylvania? Well, there is a such thing as a vampire bat. Actually, there are 3 species of vampires, but none of them occur in Pennsylvania. And except for occasional strays in some of the caves that are close to the Mexican border, we don't usually see vampire bats in the United States. I have an example of a vampire bat, and I also have an example of a fruit bat called a flying fox. And I just want to show them both because Hollywood would like you to believe that a vampire bat would be this big, but that's a flying fox that only eats fruit, and this is a vampire bat. So they're very different, and believe it or not, they are adapted to only lap blood, to bite, and usually they're biting livestock, and then they lap a certain amount of blood and are able to digest it pretty rapidly. So that's your vampire. Not too glamorous. Are all bats nocturnal? Well, the ones that we have in Pennsylvania and pretty much throughout North America, well, I should say throughout Canada and the U.S. are. But once you start getting into the tropical areas, bats are adapted for all kinds of different feeding habits. And so some of them are fruit eaters, and they also use their eyes rather than echolocating because it's pretty easy to find fruit in a tree, and they don't need to echolocate for that. But there are also bats. In fact, I have an example of one that eats fish, and so this is a fishing bat from Suriname. And you can see it's especially adapted to grappling a small fish with its hind feet, which are have razor sharp claws, and they echolocate off of ripples in the water to discover a fish that's pretty close to the surface that they can go in and swoop in and collect. And all the footage I've ever seen of these guys, it appears to be daylight footage. So, but there are nectar-feeding bats. There are bats that do a lot of good, not only insect eating, but also pollinating fruit and that kind of pollinating flowers that eventually become fruit. And so, some really don't need to be out at night.